Hey, what's going on? This is Brother Hi John. We're going to be dealing with ancient Egyptian philosophy today. And this is going to bring clarity on a huge dilemma that we're still dealing with today in the modern world, and why philosophy is important today in our society, modern society. We're going to go to the wisdom of the ancient spiritual systems of Egypt and so on in Africa to help us understand the pitfalls and the dilemmas that we're dealing with right now. Now, let me get this clear right out the gate, is that one of the big dilemmas that this text is dealing with is the gender war and the issues of copulation and marriage, and basically why there's a competition of power and a struggle in the household, and why there's so many broken homes, and why there's so many divorces and so much conflict, so much disappointment and antagonism between the genders in the household. So I'm gonna read this quote, and we're gonna be able to line it up. It says, "Do not trust your wife with with your money." Now, it's very interesting because in modern day society, with the development of the Western culture, it deals with a culture where women, since basically the 1960s, 1950s, have gotten a whole lot of liberties and freedom. One thing we need to think about is, why didn't the Egyptians, if they were so wise, we mean one of the most wise and most advanced civilizations that ever hit this planet, with their philosophy and with their teachings, why weren't they able to reach the same liberties for the women that we're doing today? Now, there's a lot of people that are in the Kemetic community and the Kemetic spiritual systems in modern day that do what we call Kemetic revival, or they into Egyptian romanticism. It's also called Egyptomania, and it's a certain level of obsession with the ancient Egyptian culture. Now, remember, I'm not dealing with ancient Egyptian culture or the ordinary lifestyle of the ancient Egyptians. We're dealing with the philosophy, the spiritual practices, the spiritual knowledge. Period. That's it. But there is a Afrocentric, even if you want to say that, or black cultural connection that they're making with a Egyptian revival, and it's been going on since the 70s, 60s to this very day, and it's very popular. I was raised under it. My mother was initiated. Her name is Egyptian. I was raised under this knowledge of the Egyptian spiritual system my whole life, in general. So I'm very well familiar and exposed to how this thing goes. But what I'm dropping is the information of the philosophy that was glossed over, that no one really paid attention to. So we're going to dive deep into that. But what's clear is it's giving us insight on a dilemma, a struggle between the two genders, between male and female. It says something to the extent of, do not trust your wife with your money. Basically, no more money than a year's worth do you allow her to be able to hold at any given time. Now, that's strange. That's interesting, because one misconception that people do in the modern world when they try to translate the value systems and cultures of the ancient African and Asian world, or their cultures, is that we assume that there was no level of resistance against female liberty, or the liberty of the women in the society, to the extent of rulership, power, dominance, control, and specifically we mean over resources. Now, the thing that is key is that people go into the spiritual or religious aspects, and they say, well, in the Western world, Christianity doesn't acknowledge the female principle, the female principle deities. There is no mother goddess, or there is no female goddesses. But the thing is, that's a misconception as well. In the Hebrew mythology and the Hebrew culture that we call them biblical, they do have goddesses that they call them Elat, and there's a plethora, a whole pantheon of feminine deities in that cosmology. You just have to research it. The primary goddess, her name is Kokma, but they call her Alet or Asherah, and not the daughter, which is basically Ishtar, the daughter. But the higher goddess is named Atarat. Now, this is a female principle that's in the Christian world, that's in the Hebrew world, or the biblical world. So we can't throw stones and try to make a contrast between the two cultures, when basically they come from the same exact region. Basically, the Canaanite or the Levant or the Middle Eastern region, Egypt is right there. And fundamentally, the culture before the Bible or Abraham or any of them people, it fundamentally is the same root system and culture. They shared deities, they shared concepts. At one point, they even shared language. And even to one extent, 25,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, they were the same people genetically based on blood. The Semitic, Asiatic bloods I'm not talking about. I'm talking about the African bloods, the haplogroup E, the E haplogroup. Nevertheless, let's go back to the point about Egypt and its philosophy. We in the modern world contrast Christianity against all things that are African and say they're misogynistic today, they oppress women today. But in ancient Africa, in ancient Egypt, there was no signs, there was no aspects of a competition between the genders at all. We totally revered the woman. They was absolutely supreme, period. That's it. That's history. That's all that she wrote. No. That's a dilemma there, because the power of the Egyptian pharaoh was supreme, period. At some points, they had female pharaohs that sat in that position of a male pharaoh. But that's interesting that male pharaohs were never female pharaohs, meaning male pharaohs were never queens, but you did have queens that became kings. So why is it that dichotomy of gender? When we're dealing with civilization, I'm going to be unpacking that in this channel. We're going to deal with gender and history and dealing with civilization and how it developed and why men took dominance. But I'm not promoting male dominance over females, and I'm not promoting civilization whatsoever. I'm also not promoting a archaic, primitive like lifestyle either. What we're promoting is the primitive ascetic, or the ascetic or spiritual path, which is where both genders are completely neutral and equal, but neutral in the sense that there is no competition. Because what I'm showing in ancient Egypt is a cultural development that reached a climax in the Middle Kingdom, where it showed a huge level of intelligence and growth, psychological and a metaphysical growth of these people's awareness of human nature and the nature of this physical world that we call the earth, the physical plane. They grew huge awareness of this, and that was the birth of philosophy. Right around the change, when the Old Kingdom collapsed, moving into the Middle Kingdom is when this is being developed. These texts are being written. So what they understood was human nature, as it is associated with animal nature and nature itself, which is basically brute and it's evil. So in nature, let's go to nature, and we'll help understand this as we move into the human world, and I'll conclude with my point with this text. In nature, there's a competition between the black widow spider, female and male, right? There's a manipulation going on, there's tactics going on, and one dies and one lives. But the female is dominant amongst those spiders, right? We can go to other species of animals, and the male is dominant and the female is submissive, right? A lot of primates and so on, a lot of mammals, that's the case, like the bull and the cow. So this dynamic is not about which gender is better whatsoever. This dynamic is that there is a genetic or a biological war or competition between which nature will dominate this female attributes or these male attributes, based on the household or based on the village, and then based on what the society or the nation. So America, modern day, is dealing with the same unseen resistance and struggle that has always existed in nature and the animal world. The problem is we've created myths and constructs that's able to brush this under the rug, and we avoid the conversation, we avoid the reality. And what we did with that is, today in the modern world, we have the biblical narrative, and as soon as you open up Genesis, it talks about Adam and Eve, and then that construct is what we all generally accept, and then we never speak of it again. And in that construct, the biblical construct, yes, the woman plays a submissive role. It says that she was made as a helpmeet, not equal, as a helpmeet, only to help the man do his duty, which was basically to take care and groom and crop the earth, and name the animals and raise the animals, and all of this folklore. I mean, it's not literal, it's folklore, but the problem is we take it literal, and then we put the woman in the position of that, and we live our lives doing what Genesis talks about, be fruitful and multiply, while that woman has to pay the price through the pain that it mentions that was her curse of producing children. That was what a curse. So this video I'm dropping as well is dealing with antinatalism. I'm a mild antinatalist, meaning I don't promote the idea that we should generally produce children and bring children into this world arbitrarily without any level of preparedness or any level of structure. Meaning, we got to be real serious about bringing souls into this world. Generally, if you're ignorant and you don't have a certain level of attainment already in your adulthood, basically you shouldn't bring no humans into this world. You see, the reason why that construct exists, I'll go into history and show how we got to where we are, where we naturally tried to do this. And we are all fighting for that right, or fighting for that entitlement to bring human beings and souls into this world. But it's a great evil in general that shouldn't be perpetuated. We need to think more with more introspection about that act. But there is specific specific excluded scenarios and situations where we might want to bring souls into this world to do specific tasks and duties, but we have to be very serious and very prepared and be premeditated about what we're doing when we bring that soul into this world. You see, and this is going into the ancient Asian and African spiritual systems. They became masters at deciding what souls they want on this plane. You see, because generally this world, in the ancient and African systems, is generally this world in its highest philosophy, not its lowest, highest philosophy, not culture, philosophy. The highest debated philosophy and the conclusion of all the greatest philosophers is that this world is nothing but suffering, or dukkha. And the root of it, you can see the suffering end up being in what we call competition over resources or money between animals. You see, and how animals eat each other and slaughter each other. But that's over what? Hunger and resources, that itch that needs to be scratched. Next is the competition between sexuality. But then there's the competition on a much deeper and more intimate level between the male and female, competition over dominating the space and dominating the resources and having the dominant role, the dominant position. Because with that dominant position comes access to a diversity of different things that we desire. You see what I'm saying? Food, clothing, property, fame, status, control, all of that. So we know a lot of women feel violated and feel insulted as a gender when they don't see themselves in high positions of power in government, in politics, and also in business. You know what I'm saying? So to males, it may not be that serious, but to females, it's a real war. Just like there's racism, for them, it's sexism and sexual discrimination or gender discrimination. You see, basically saying that women do not have the right to dominate and rule equally or over, especially over the males in the household or in any institution in this modern world. So if you understand that is a war that is literally the same type of war that's equal to racism or equal to a religious war, you know what I'm saying? But what I'm doing is showing you the root of why that war is perpetual and it's inevitable conflict if we don't understand what we're in the aspect of what is this physical and material world, to the extent of not just humans but also animals. So us being trapped in the cycle of this animal or brute world, what's inevitable is competition, because there's diversity and we're both trying to survive and thrive. And thriving, I mean enjoyment, trying to enjoy these pleasures. The price of that is it's always going to be butting of heads and always going to be conflict. So what the ancient Egyptians realized moving into the Middle Kingdom is human nature and animal nature and nature itself. I said that's the first thing. Second, they realize in nature and in this reality there is something that needs to be done when it comes to instructing husbands or males that are householders, not priests or not holy men, but the household is the one who are basically farmers and craftsmen and so on that pay taxes, that are under the pharaoh. They need to know how to, at that point, civilly deal with their female counterparts, what we might call wives. And during that era, we see what instruction was given. It says, do not trust your wife with your money, period. So if you can't trust your wife, then what the hell is the point of marriage in the first place? Well, that's interesting, because when we're dealing with ancient Egypt and we're dealing with ancient Phoenicia, ancient India, ancient Tibet, many different ancient African societies, they realized through philosophy that we need to bring this physical world to a closure. What we think it is not exactly what it is. It's an illusion, you see. And this is a sleep that we're under, where it's the slaying of the body of Osiris that was chopped up in many different pieces, and it causes the illusion of the experience that we're in. So we have to unite back with Osiris in the spiritual world or heaven. This soterology, or this salvation teaching, this gospel teaching, is what ends up becoming Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and all of the different liberation theologies, the ideas of salvation of your soul, and all of these other spiritual systems. But it first developed in Africa, on the Nile, in East Africa. And it spread, and it reached its climax in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, and also in Kush. Wherever Ethiopia or the Ethiopians or Kushites went, this philosophy reached its climax. And the top idea was to practice, to renounce the world, to renounce the household, men and women, those who are the elite spiritually in that society, to renounce the world or the society or the civilization and seek the spiritual world, seek the deity, seek the world beyond the veil. And that's the message today dealing with philosophy. But we have to understand the error and the flaw of our ignorance when it comes to the competition and the conflict between genders. It's inevitable. It's innate. It's inside of the operating system of nature to have us go against each other based on that illusion that we call gender and sexuality. Because it's a competition. The same thing, the same way it plays the lion versus the gazelle. Or inside of each animal species, that male gender versus the female gender, where one has to end up being a sacrifice or end up being the submissive or dominated role, the dominant and the dominated role, the ruler and the oppressed role. It's inevitable. And we have this idealism of this utopia that has never come, and I'm trying to tell you, based on gender, will never come, because it's innate. I'll go in the future and I'll go on a whiteboard, I'll make a chart, and I'll describe this thoroughly, the details of biology, DNA, science. We'll break down the whole science and show you that it's innate inside of our biology. It's not something that can be fixed through prayer, through intervention, through politics, through voting. None of that. It's innate. The war is innate. Like I said, just like in nature, between the lion and the gazelle, right? Between different wild animals. We really are still in that animal state, and we haven't awakened from it because we have these religious archaic constructs that we created before we reached that realization that I'm speaking of liberation theology and high level advanced philosophy. That's reached an idea of, like the ancient Egyptians, pessimism to the extent of renouncing the world, renouncing the physical world, and seeking liberation of our soul to ascend back into the spiritual world, which the Egyptians called the Aru fields, or Aru. They also call it the Seker Aket, or the Aket realms, right? And we need to leave this physical domain and become Aku, or ascended masters, or ascended ancestors. So that was the goal that developed at some point in the hearts and minds of the most advanced intellectual and spiritual Egyptians during the Middle Kingdom. And then it developed even more thorough as we get into the late period, especially like the Ptolemaic period, with the Serapis cult and the Sem priests and the Isis cults much later. In the later part of Egypt, at the temples of Alexandria and the temples of Serapis. The libraries of Alexandria and the temples of Serapis. So all of this I can give references to. I'll be documenting all this in the future, but we're trying to understand the gender dynamics and why there's this conflict. I'm sure when women read this, they're gonna be surprised. Wow, I didn't know that was in the African and the Egyptian culture. This dominance and submissive role that they were allotted to based on the wisdom teachings of these texts. But what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that that's the conclusion of the matter. I'm saying that that was for the meantime that the Egyptians decided to conclude on, that the husbands do not trust your woman with your money. So what type of system were we dealing with? A construct way before the white people interceded, or white people got involved with our culture of African spirituality and African culture, way before Europeans interceded and way before Asians interceded and got involved. We had that position of dominance of the male the same way we have it today. So what I'm saying is not that we should promote that and conclude with that, because those philosophers and those wise men, those priests, didn't conclude that. They said, okay, we need to figure out a way to stop this inevitable conflict of dominance in the family and amongst married couples and amongst different nations and different clans and different ethnic groups. We need to end this completely between humans and animals, because we're going to destroy each other with this division, this diversity that's natural in nature. We need to ascend above nature, ascend above the physical world, and reach those worlds for which we came. They might say Orion or the Sirius star systems and so on. They say the spiritual world in general. That is the theology that eventually developed and spread to the whole world from Africa. So that gender war, so you see the dynamic that's mentioned here. Like I said, do not trust your woman with your money. So the question is, back then, you mean to tell me that she didn't have enough money on her own, that she can't take care of herself? You see, she didn't have her own vocation where she couldn't depend on herself and not depend on him, her husband. Well, that's the same dynamic that women have been complaining about, dealing with oppression in the modern world, isn't it? The same exact conflict and contrast and parallel today, where the women are claiming that they're dealing with not being able to be independent and make their own resources and not depend on the male. Because clearly it's showing a situation where that wife, those wives that he's instructing, are dependent on those males for their resources and for their livelihood. You see? So what I'm saying as a conclusion, what is the solution to the ancient Egyptian problem? Well, the ancient Egyptians knew this. They knew for those who were devout, those who were expert, those who were advanced enough, who had enough discipline and enough spiritual desire to renounce the physical world and go and construct temples and seek the mystery of what this material world is thoroughly. And they were advanced at it. They were serious about it. They invested a lot of resources into building these temples and building these priesthoods, and create an order of devout holy men and women who can tear apart the illusion of this physical world, or this veil. It's called the veil of Ascetic, or the veil of Isis, and pierce into the spiritual world and find a way to navigate ourselves into that spiritual state and ascend. That was their theology. That was the ancient Egyptian conclusion. Not all of the pomp of all of the wealth, the gold, the power, the pyramids, the palaces, the thrones, the kings, the queens, all of that, the Egyptians realized causes what? A gender war, a conflict between the genders, because one is going to dominate the other, period. It's inevitable. And I'll go thoroughly into that in the future. So what we have to do is we have to abandon the value systems that are materialistic and worldly, that are based on building wealth and power and dominance, because there's going to be a victim. There's going to be someone who suffers at the expense of that. Ancient Egypt is also known to be one of the biggest civilization with the highest level of wealth inequality in world history. Wealth inequality, that means rich versus the poor. So for every pharaoh you see, there's probably hundreds of thousands or maybe even 250,000 to 1 million people that are in poverty and begging, that are beggars and that were suffering in ancient Egypt, you see. And the same contrast is here in today in America, where there's the 1% that owns all of the wealth, or the 1 to 3% that owns all of the wealth, and all of the 80 to 60%, and even the lower 40% are totally in poverty. You see, that's what that does. It creates people who end up being oppressed at the expense of you having your entitlement and your inherited dominant position. You see, and also we see that same contrast with the gender conflict when we're dealing with that wealth inequality, with the competition over resources. Today we call it capitalism, you see. So the conclusion and solution is we have to finish the job that the Egyptians were trying to develop at a certain plateau, at a certain apex of their philosophy and their ideology. And as basically we have to overcome the petty, animalistic, selfish desires that we're trying to perpetuate through family and through householding and building wealth and building the empire, and trying to every individual trying to get to that court or to that palace or even to get that throne. And that causes conflict between the biological relationships of the household and the family in general on a much local and intimate level, you see. And so with that particular knowledge, the solution would be, like I said, what the Egyptians realized is you have to become like the sin priest and those priests of Aset or Isis, those priests of Amun, those priests of Harpocrates, the later name of him, Harpocrates, the priest of Khonsu or Horus, and also as those priests of Serapis. His original name was Asar Apis, and during the Middle Kingdom, Asar Apis around Memphis, and Amun around Thebes and so on, and Karnak. So the point is, these holy men and holy women, they the ones who introduced to the world the revelation and the update and the epiphany that there is a spiritual world. They brought to the world that there is a spiritual world. They brought the epiphany and the realization and the knowledge, the awareness out of all of the different years that we've spent here on this physical plane before that period of Egypt, or that period of the African and Asian development. They brought that revelation of the spiritual world being a reality. So that made them have to refine and reflect and do introspection on what culture and value systems do they actually have when it comes to the oppression of other ethnic groups, to the oppression of other people, of their own people, because of wealth inequality and competition over resources, and also between the conflict between genders, which we're still dealing with that dilemma today, which is a shame because we should have learned our lesson basically 3,000 or 4,000 or so years ago, you see. But still we are here to this day, and we're still dealing with this battle, this fight over money. And that's what money or resources or this war over the physical world will do when it comes to hunger and a desire of survival and a desire to thrive. It causes what? Competition and conflict, you see. And that causes division, war, destruction, and then that eventually causes what? Suffering, which is inevitable. I started the video by saying that's what the ancient philosophers realized. Because animals, which humans are animals, are trying to survive in nature, they harm each other by that hunger being innate in their gut or in their sexual organs or in their body. So we have to overcome those lower desires, those lower organs, and ascend to a higher organ in our body inside of our temple. And that itself will help us get free and liberated from the inevitable suffering that comes between the war between genders, or the war between skin color or ethnic groups, or the war between wealth status and wealth position, or position in society. So with that, hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. Like I said, what they published in that philosophical text, this philosophical text that I'm dealing with right now, what they published in that was I'm trying to show you the contrast of the conflict they had back in those days with gender and with between the males and females, or wives and husbands, with relationships, and the dominant struggle, the tug of war of dominance and power that existed then. Equality is a myth. Equality is a construct of idealism, but not of realism or reality. Like I said, you can look at many animals in nature and see the gender dynamics in nature with these animals and insects and so on, and you'll see how diabolical and brutal and sadistic and manipulative it naturally is. So what we need to do as humans, and even becoming gods or aku or netchers, is we need to ascend above that animal base state and ascend into spiritual beings. And we only have, as individuals, this one life to attain that apex or that goal. So with that seriousness, if you understand and you see what society is going through, what they've been going through since the 50s and 60s with feminism, and now what we have as a social conflict or social resistance, even on the male side, everybody's complaining and everybody feels like they've been violated. It's because it's innate and natural in nature. Just look at evidence. You'll see the evidence in nature. So with that, I conclude with that solution. And the question is, for everybody that sees this, according to the ancient Egyptian wisdom and according to what we know today, my question to you personally is, should you trust your wife with your money? You see? And for the woman, how would you feel if your husband said that he can't trust you with his money, and he allowed you not to have any money, and you were dependent on him, and you can only attain or hold a year's worth of money and nothing beyond that. How would you feel about that, you woman? And for you men, should you trust your wife with your money? And if you can't trust your wife with your money, the question is, why can't you trust your wife with your money? And with that, this is Brother Hot John. I'm going to be dealing with this philosophy way more thoroughly. I'll be going to the whiteboard. I'll be breaking it down. Like I said, biology, neurology, DNA, evolution, and science. And all of that should be able to open the gate to what philosophy and bring a closure to what all ignorance and bring a closure to this physical world, like we said earlier, which is a world of suffering. We're trying to attain the world of bliss, the eternal world of bliss, the spiritual world, which the Egyptians called the Aku, or the realm of Aket, right? So with that, peace. This is Brother Hot John. Subscribe, like, share, and that, I say peace.